Welcome to our club. Thanks for coming along for tonight's programme, all of you, and any of you who are not members. Our membership's actually rising at the moment, so you're joining a trend if you decide to join the club. There's a lot going on this year. We have elections galore in this region, a lot of other issues we hope to cover. So if you're not a member, please do consider it. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Head. I'm on the board of the FCCT and seem to have been on it most of my life. I'm also the correspondent for the BBC based here in Bangkok. And before we get on with tonight's programme, just would like to alert you to things that are coming up at the club. Please keep in mind our film series on Mondays. We had a fabulous film on the Bauhaus architecture tradition last night. Next week we're showing a film looking at the issue of food wastage and how much there is in particular in the United States. I can't guarantee it'll be a particularly appetizing film, but it's certainly a very relevant one. We're also planning now, we haven't got it fixed in our diaries yet, but because we now know we have an election taking place in Thailand on the 24th of March, the club will be hosting a number of events relating to that. Some we hope will be more explanatory because it's quite a complex electoral system and environment, and some we hope will be able to showcase some of the political participants who will be contesting this election. We're also planning an evening which we're still trying to pin down the date for on Thailand's emerging marijuana business, and it's a little more interesting than you think. Can't guarantee you free samples, but we are planning to get apparently the man who is Mr. Big of the marijuana money in Thailand. I think that's the legal business, and he's going to tell us all about it and why it is the next big thing in this country. So let's get on to tonight's events. Oh, just one other thing for those who are members. We have an annual general meeting. Normally this is held late January, early February, but we found that for accounting reasons, because our accounts only close in late December, and we have to present them at the annual general meeting, that it's much more convenient to have it in March. And we will have an annual general meeting in March when you can toss all of those of us who are on the board out and propose your own candidates if that's what you want. Or if you want to do it Thai style, you can simply bring in a tank and have a coup. We're not fussy, but we do like people to show up for the AGM, if possible, cast your votes, take part in it. That actually does decide to some degree the direction of the club. And if any of you think you'd be fantastic board members, come and volunteer yourselves. So let's get on to tonight's programme. We've done programmes at this club many times before, not just on Myanmar, but on the situation in Rakhine. In particular, since the violence and the mass exodus and, in some terms, UN terms, ethnic cleansing of Rohingyas that started actually well before August 2017, but really escalated at that point, creating one of the biggest political crises to confront this region in recent years. But the situation in Rakhine is a great deal more complex than just the plight of the Rohingyas and the clashes with the security forces, or their treatment by the security forces. In the last few years, we've also seen actually much more significant military confrontations between the Arakan army, which is an army purporting to represent the interests of the Rakhine Buddhist population, a relative newcomer to the very numerous world of Myanmar ethnic armies. They only founded themselves in 2009 and operated mostly well away from Rakhine State on Myanmar's eastern border with China, along with the Kachin Independence Army. But in the last few years, they have moved back, clearly well-funded, reasonably well-armed, into Rakhine State and have been taking on the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, posing a far more significant military challenge to the military than any Rohingya militants ever did. It is complex, and it illustrates, I think, the other complexities that underpin the situation in Rakhine State, where you have a deeply resentful Rakhine population who are hostile to the Muslim population, but at the same time very hostile to the Burmese state. There's also a very bitter and painful history in that state, which to a large degree explains the events that we've seen in recent years, and our speakers tonight, I hope, will be able to throw quite a lot of light on that. We're very pleased tonight to have two of the most experienced Myanmar watchers to talk about this. On the far right, is David Matheson. Some of you may have read his articles in Asia Times. He has been working in this region for more years than I can count, who now describes himself as an independent political analyst, but who has been monitoring the Arakan army very closely indeed. Next to him is Richard Horsey, another veteran who's been living in Myanmar for the best part, certainly since the start of the millennium, in various guises, but you may know some of his excellent work for the International Crisis Group. He does do consultancies for other people too. He's also an independent political analyst. And then nearest to me is Gwen Robinson, who is the editor-at-large at the Nikkei Asian Review, and again a journalist of enormous experience in this region, and who in particular has focused on Myanmar in recent years and has probably the best contact book of any journalist dealing with Myanmar. So I'll allow them to outline their own views about what's going on in Rakhine State, and I'll start, David, with you if I can.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's great to be back at the FCCT. I thought before we'd actually start, and I'm going to outline the background and the aims and objectives and the recent operations of the Arakan Army. But this is a relatively new army. It turns 10 years old in April. And it is marked by having a very rigorous social media presence and a very slick public relations campaign, including videos. So I thought I'd start by showing one of their recruitment and promotional videos to start off with first.
Tan.
country back.
Our Arakan kingdom was very wealthy, and we are very proud about our ancestral inheritance and its history. Under the Burmese rule, we became very poor and we lost everything that we had. We have lost our rights, the right of the indigenous people.
This is our NCO Fit and Die Care group, and this is our Arakan Army women and troops. Over 750.
We fight for freedom.
This is Arakan soldier. Right now they are training, to kill our enemies.
So I think that gives a brief introduction into the Arakan Army and the kind of historical grievances that they have, but also a sense of the scale of this army. Since January the 4th, when the Arakan Army attacked 4 border guard police outposts in Buthidown in Rakhine State, I've had quite a number of phone calls and emails asking the question, who are the Arakan Army? And I think given the horrendous events in Rakhine State over the past several years, a lot of attention has quite rightly focused on the plight of the Rohingya. But while that has been going on, this army of young Rakhine nationalists have been forming to fight against what they see as the real enemy, which is the Burmese state and the Burmese military. Now, where did they come from? Well, they actually came from the other end of the country. It's not even on the map, but all the way up in the north in Kachin State. Now, it goes to show just how long the civil war in Myanmar has been raging, in that this young nucleus of 6 young Rakhine who were very middle class, very well educated, and a lot of them educated in Yangon, decided to start a new round of Rakhine insurgency against the central state. Now, Rakhine insurgency against the central state has been going on since the early 70s. And actually, the Arakan Liberation Party is a signatory to the nationwide ceasefire agreement that was signed in 2015. But these guys, the Arakan Army, decided that movement was moribund and not really connecting contemporary grievances with historical aspirations. And so a small group of them formed in the Kachin Independence Army area and slowly recruited mostly from young Rakhine working in the jade mines of Pakhan. So they had a ready pool of recruits. I remember meeting one of the leaders in 2012 in northern Thailand, and I asked about the aspirations and what he was going to do. And it's quite remarkable that everything he said back in 2012, which I thought was rather fanciful and far-fetched, has mostly come true. They have expanded to a force of, estimates are between 3,000 to 8,000 soldiers, training up in, as I said, KIA area, and the KIA one of the most well-organised, battle-hardened insurgent groups. So they really came from this sorry, I'm not getting that right. It sounded really good when I was trying it out today. This incubator of insurgency up in the north. So they had lots of recruits, very good training, and a place away from Rakhine to actually mobilise. And so they had several years. When the ceasefire with the Kachin broke down, they also got combat experience. And slowly they started moving their forces down through the country and setting up bases first in Paletwa, in Chin State here. Now, the first reported engagement between the Arakan Army in these areas was 2015. And according to the Tatmadaw, the True News Information Team of the Tatmadaw, there's been 158 reported clashes up until the middle of January this year. Now, one thing that I think we should all realise is that the tempo of these attacks have steadily risen since 2015. and we see most of the attacks of the AA happening from October last year. And I started tracking this after October last year, when these reports from the AA and what the Tatmadaw was acknowledging actually started to rise. Now, these are attacks that are not just in these very isolated parts of Palepwa up on the Caladan River, but in about 5 different townships. And so attacks in Buthidaung, Choctaw, and Rathidaung in the past month or so, actual RPG attacks against government security forces 5 miles outside of Rathidaung, RPG attacks. Another report of an attack in Ann Township down here, which is also the headquarters of the Western Command of the Burmese military. So I think what's really important is that the scale and the geographic reach of a lot of these attacks has steadily grown. Now, what are the aims and objectives of the Arakan Army? What do they want to achieve? Well, in a lot of their social media campaigning and on their websites and their publication material, which is definitely more sophisticated than a lot of the other insurgent groups in Myanmar, they call for what they term the Way of Rakita, which is their way of calling for a nationwide revolution of the Rakhine against the Burmese state, to get freedom for Rakhine state, back for the Rakhine people. Now, they've been very, very slick, in my view, in very rarely mentioning the Rohingya or any grievances against Muslims. Only occasionally do they talk about how the Rohingya don't belong. So this shows, I think, militarily and politically and socially, that they're very patient, they're very well organised, and they're tapping into a lot of Rakhine grievances that you hear when you speak to Rakhine in Sittwe and even further out. A lot of people talk about how they support and admire the AA, because the AA are fighting who they see as the enemy, which is the Burmese military. The other thing to consider is, and as the video demonstrated, they're very well equipped. Now, this is a relatively professional army that can move what some have estimated to be 3,000 soldiers from the north down to these areas with their weapons and with that level of organisation, and slowly starting to move into more built-up areas. How are they financing this? Well, no one really knows, but it seems rather likely, and it has been alleged by the government on a number of occasions, that the AA is being financed through the methamphetamines trade. Now, considering that they operate up in Kachin, a neighbouring northern Shan state, which is a major producer of yaba and other drugs, it seems likely that they are involved in some way, but they rigorously deny that they are involved. Now, just before I hand it over to Richard to have a look at the bigger picture nationally, what can we expect in the next few years? Well, the AA themselves have said that Arakan 2020 is their dream. That basically they want to escalate attacks ahead of an election year. There's an election plan for the end of 2020. And this could indicate an expansion of their attacks and their ambushes in various parts of the state. But this has also come with a counter-reaction. Basically, the Burmese military have gotten the green light from the government to crush and annihilate the AA. And they've sent large numbers of troops into Buthidaung, Choctaw, and Rathidaung to hunt down the AA. The AA have sanctuary bases, we think, in Paletwa, and possibly here just across the border into Bangladesh. So they've got very rugged border areas to hide in, and the terrain is on their side, and a lot of the local population support them quite a bit. So this is an insurgency, I think, that a lot of people have taken their eyes off in the past several years. And we need to understand and follow this army better, and to understand really how it impacts both the politics of Rakhine, the possibility of Rohingya refugee returns, and future stability in the state, all of which looks incredibly grim at the moment. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Dave. Hello, everyone. So why should we care about this? Why should you care about this? Okay, it's another insurgency among a dozen or 2 dozen in Myanmar. It's a reasonably big one. It's growing. But what makes this particularly worrying? Why are we here talking about the Arakan Army as opposed to the KIO or the Shan State Army, North or South, or the WA or any other insurgent group? And I want to say something about why I think this emergence of the AA and its stepping up of attacks is so significant. I think the first point to make is that this is not just about insurgency, it's also about politics. So the recent attacks by the Arakan Army on the Independence Day of Myanmar on the 4th of January on police bases were very symbolic, not only because it was Independence Day, but because I think this marked, in a way, a break or a shift of Rakhine sentiment from politics to armed struggle. And I think we need to remember that unlike many of the insurgencies in Myanmar, which are by uplands people, it's hill tribes, it's people, peoples who've lived in the mountains and have never been integrated into the Myanmar state, and they're far away from the centers of power. They were never incorporated under British Burma. They've never been incorporated into the modern state. They see the Burmese state as an invading state, and they don't like it, right? And that's the typical pattern of the Shan, the Wa, the Karen, the Kachin. The Rakhine are a little bit different. They're a lowland people, they're a rice-growing people, they're cousins of the Burmese, and they had their own kingdom, which vied for power with the Burmese kingdoms. And they were only brought under Burmese control, under the control of Burmese kingdoms, very shortly before the colonial period. There was only about 40 years between when the Rakhine kingdom fell, when it was invaded by the Burmese, and when the British invaded and annexed that part of Burma in the First Anglo-Burmese War. So they don't feel like they're part of this country, and they also don't feel like they're part of the periphery. They feel like they're their own kingdom. And that's given rise to this very strong historical grievance, and you saw there on the Arakan Army video, the coins from 3000 BC or whatever it was, and this storied picture of them as the original inhabitants of the land, and so on. So there's this deep history, and I think what they've been convinced about, the majority of Rakhine people, is not only that there were all these wrongs in the past, but those historical wrongs continue into the present day. And I think the Rakhine people have mostly concluded that politics has failed them. And it's quite easy to see why. They won a landslide election victory in 2015. The key Rakhine party won the same kind of landslide in Rakhine State as the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, won in central Myanmar. They won 80+% of the seats in the central Rakhine constituencies. They won by far the largest number of elected seats, and they got precisely zero political power out of this. The government, the president, exercised his constitutional authority to appoint whoever he chose to head a government, and he chose a minority NLD government in the state and a set of NLD ministers. So they felt that, they'd done extremely well in the elections, they'd won a resounding victory, and they got nothing. Not only did they not get executive control over the state, they got no consultation. That's their feeling. They felt like Naypyidaw was far away, was administering their affairs, had appointed this minority government, but had not bothered to consult them about this or about any of the many decisions that would affect their lives. And then to add insult to injury, well, there was a literal injury. There was a shooting incident in the beginning of January last year where a number of Rakhine youth were shot by the police in an overreaction to a demonstration. There was never any accounting for that, as the Rakhine see it, by the Myanmar government. And then shortly after, their key political leader, Dr. Among, was arrested, and he remains in prison on high treason charges, for which the only possible sentence is death or life imprisonment. And there's every indication that in this kind of national security case, they expect that a guilty verdict is very likely. So they won the elections, they got no power, their political leader was arrested and faces a potential death sentence, and they feel that the marginalization, the impoverishment, all of the ills that they've talked about over generations are continuing. That's a very strong sentiment. Whenever you go to Sitwe, you get that, you hear that from all walks of life. And so I think they've concluded from all this, the political route is not working. There are elections in 2020, but what is there to play for? sure, we can put forward a party, we can aim to win a majority of the votes, of the seats, and what will it get us? The same as what we have now. So for them, their Arakan Dream 2020 is not about victory in the elections. It's about taking back their sovereignty, and that's how they phrase it. And notice that most ethnic armed groups in Myanmar talk about federalism. They talk about becoming equal partners in a union. The Arakan Army is not talking about that. They're talking about restoring the sovereignty of the ancient Rakhine Kingdom. Now, they call it confederation, not independence, but when you listen to what they say about confederation and how they talk about it, it's basically independence, right? It's independence light. So I think what has happened is just at the moment when the political track appeared to be closed off, this armed struggle track has opened. And the Arakan Army, through its slick videos and the quite eloquent and charismatic presentations of its leader, has excited the Rakhine. They've got something to be excited and proud about, finally. Now, this dream could end in a nightmare very easily. But for the moment, they're not thinking about nightmarish endings. They're thinking about how wonderful this dream is and how pleasant it is to engage in this dream. And I think that's a real problem. It's a real problem for the Myanmar government because they now have not only this group of insurgents, but they have, I would say probably a majority of the Rakhine population now convinced that armed struggle is the way to go and that independence or confederation is the way to go. And there's only really one way you can deal with that. You have to make the armed struggle track less attractive, which is pretty hard, because it's a pretty powerful narrative and a powerful dream, backed by some great drone videography. But on the other hand, if you can do anything to open up that political track, you can maybe take some heat, take some momentum away from the armed struggle track. But unfortunately, there's no sign that that's the thinking in Naypyidaw. So after the attacks on Independence Day, a security meeting was called, including the Commander-in-Chief, the President, Aung San Suu Kyi, and the readout given by the presidential spokesman of that was that we have instructed the military to crush the Arakan Army. And the spokesman went on to say some other things in that press conference and subsequent comments which have inflamed Rakhine sentiment, let's say. So at the moment when what I think the government would need to do to deal with this is not a hard military response, which will polarize a lot of Rakhine people further against the government and give more oxygen to this insurgency, what they would need to do is take a step back and say, okay, we will release your political leader, we will engage you in dialogue about the issues of concern to you, and we will make a vow that after 2020, if we win the election, we won't appoint another minority government. Now, that's a big ask. That would be a huge step from the government. But I think it would be something like that that would be needed to take the heat out of this insurgency. And instead, we have the opposite. We have a doubling down on the military response, and that's not likely to go well because, as you've seen, they are pretty well equipped. They're hanging out in these mountains up here. They can very easily play geopolitical boundaries with the Tamador. So they have bases here. They attack a Tamador column. They move back here. The Tamador chases them. They go into this national park in Bangladesh. No roads, no border control. The army can't follow them. They pop out here in northern Budidong. And then they do some attacks around here. And then when the military chases them up, they cross across again. That seems to be, if you look at the patterns of attacks, something like what's going on. But if you are the army which seeks to represent the Rakhine population, seeks to respond to their grievances, seeks to channel their aspirations, it's no good just hanging out up here in the remote hills where no one can see you and which doesn't affect the lives of the ordinary Rakhine. And that's the worry, I think. We've not only, as Dave said, seen more attacks coming down all over this upper half of Rakhine State, but there was an assassination attempt on the convoy of the chief minister on the 1st of January, down here in Mrau, near to the old kingdom, on the road from the state capital Sittwe to Mrau. Now, the Arakan Army hasn't claimed responsibility for this, and we don't know who it was. I think if you took a poll of observers, I won't give my personal view, but if you took a poll of observers, I think it would come in sort of 95% it was probably the Arakan army that did it, because I don't think anyone can imagine anyone else who has the capability or the incentive to pull off such an attack. That at least is what many people believe. So we've shifted from attacks in the mountains down to potential assassination attempts on senior political, not military figures in the heart of the state. And I think if one was looking forward, that would be what one has to be worried about. Now, it's worth saying this is the very beginning of the story. They've just relaunched their attacks and really stepped them up in the last few months. And we don't know if they will have the organizational ability, the funding, the logistics to continue this campaign or not. Maybe it will peter out. It's very hard to do this kind of thing. But if they do manage to continue this insurgency, I think we have to worry about how they will project their authority onto the rest of Rakhine State, because that's what they're claiming independence for, not these little mountains up here. And the terrain is not amenable to insurgency when you come down into central and southern Rakhine. And so I think we have to ask the question, what else might they do in terms of projecting force? And what would that look like? And is the bombing of the Chief Minister's convoy on the 1st of January a signal of that, of what's to come or not? It's worth saying that attack cracked one windscreen of one car and damaged the wing mirror of another car. So it was not exactly a spectacular attack. But what was quite striking about it was that they had the intelligence to know where the convoy was going when. They had the ability to put roadside bombs, multiple roadside bombs, against the multiple vehicles in the convoy. They had the ability to get the timing spot on to hit those vehicles. What they were lacking was a big bang. I think the message was sent, and that might have been, one would imagine, the intention. I think the other thing that's worth saying about the Rakhine and the fact that they're this lowland people and have this strong history is that they are quite integrated into the Myanmar state in a way that other minorities are not. So because the colonial experience started in Rakhine, for many decades the Rakhine made up a majority of the intellectual elite under the colonial period. They sent the majority of students from Burma to Oxford and Cambridge. Majority were from Rakhine. The majority of the Anglo Bar was Rakhine. And even into the post-independence era, you find senior Rakhine in all walks of life, in government service, in the judiciary, in the military. There are Rakhine generals. You would never find a Shan or a Kachin general, but there are Rakhine generals. There are many, many Rakhine living across Myanmar, many in Yangon. So if there becomes a more broad conflagration between the Rakhine community and the majority Burmese community, this may not be limited to Rakhine State. So far it's playing out on Facebook. We have a lot of very aggressive nationalist rhetoric in both directions since the 4th of January attack in particular. And the question is, could this break out into real life violence? I think that's something to be worried about as well. So just to finish off, I mean, what does this mean for the future? I mean, first, we don't know, but if we were to speculate, I think there is a significant risk that this resurgent Arakan army could tip Rakhine State into a level of violence that it hasn't seen in decades. It will make even less likely any repatriation of Rohingya, because the areas that the Rohingya fled from is basically these two townships here and a little bit of this third township. Well, the Arakan army is operating in this area, which there are quite a lot of Rohingya as well. It's operating in the mountain range that divides these two townships, exactly where the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army has been hanging out in previous times as well. So it's a very mixed population. This has created, obviously, militarization, it's created fear, it's created checkpoints, it's created, in fact, a number of Rohingya have been killed in crossfire in attacks between the AA and the Myanmar military. So it's not a situation in which return looks very appetizing or appealing, even if it looked appealing before, which it didn't. So I think it pushes back any real hope of Rohingya repatriation. it's worth pointing out that just at the time when Arakan Army has been stepping up its attacks, ARSA, the Rohingya militant group, has re-emerged on the scene with a glossy 96-page report, if I remember rightly, but also with a number of attacks in Mongdor. An ambush on a border police vehicle on the 16th of January, the video of which went viral, and a couple of other attacks which seem likely to be the work of the group. That marks their first attacks in over a year. So just when the Arakan Army, the Rakhine armed group, is gearing up and operating in these areas, ARSA has reappeared on the scene as well. This could get complicated. As Dave said, I don't think it necessarily means an immediate communal conflict or armed conflict between Rakhine groups and Rohingya groups. The Rakhine are very much pitching this, and the Arakan Army in particular has made a very strong point of saying the Muslim issue is not our key priority. This is a distraction, it's a trap. Our key enemy is the Burma. They've always been the key enemy. Keep the focus on that. Don't get distracted. And I don't think ARSA has any particular incentive to attack Rakhine. So it may not be that there is direct conflagration, but the fact that you have now two different armed groups running around up there, and the Tamil, the Myanmar military, in areas of overlapping population, I think it's worrying about where this goes. Dynamics can develop and take off on their own. So I'll stop there and hand over to Gwen for her thoughts.
Thank you. Is this on? Good evening, everyone. So I'm trying to put some economic context into the excellent points that both David and Richard have made, and I'd just like to start off perhaps by putting the economy of Rakhine in perspective to really understand the dynamics here. Have we got the whole map of Rakhine there? Because I'm trying to see where Chaupu... Can we see Chaupu there? Right, at the bottom. Okay. Or maybe it... Is that enlarged, Jonathan? Can we... Yeah. Great. So, overall, the Myanmar economy, despite sort of perceptions that it's going down the toilet because of international condemnation over the Rohingya crisis, etc., is not actually falling off a cliff. It grew reasonably last year, and the projections this year are for a little more than 6%, which is slightly below the earlier projections. Overall, Rakhine State also, despite perceptions, again, that it's a complete basket case, on paper looks to be one of the richer regions of Myanmar, oddly, not least due to its strategic location on the Bay of Bengal, perfectly situated for trade, investment and transport routes between China, India and ASEAN countries. It has natural resources such as oil and gas, plentiful fish, beautiful beaches and immediate locations with connections to the Indian Ocean and key trading routes beyond. So on paper it is prosperous, and it ranks in the top 5 of 14 states and regions for investment in Myanmar. And that's really because of the oil and gas. Massive amounts have gone into that. But in reality, and to anyone who's ever visited anywhere in Rakhine apart from the beautiful beach resorts of the south, including Napoli, it is clearly a very, very poor state. And it's in fact the second poorest on some measures, including indicators like unemployment and also share of government revenue. So this state has been generating a lot of revenues for not just this government and previous, but from early days military governments, with huge amounts being paid by foreign companies for offshore oil and gas exploration. None of that, well, almost very little of that goes back to the state. And as you can see on all indicators of unemployment and per head, per capita income, rock bottom poverty. And this, as Richard and David have pointed out, is really fueling so much resentment on the part of local Rakhine. Just to give you a couple more insights, in a population of more than 3 million, which is probably actually much less than 3 million now that nearly 1 million Rohingya have left, but over 60% are of working age, but it has the lowest labour force participation rates, one of the lowest electrification levels of just barely more than 20% of households electrified, and less than 20% of households with access to safe drinking water. That said, foreign direct investment rates surprisingly high, as I said, amongst the top 5, and as of January, about 17 foreign companies had invested about $9 billion worth, but in hotels and tourism, with a bit into livestock fisheries, and then the rest into oil and gas. The big focus now, and in the overall context of what we're talking about tonight, I think the high stakes here in terms of if we're looking at a really escalating insurgency is the big projects for China down south in, on the central Rakhine coast, where Richard's just pointing out, Chaopu on the western coast, which is now being developed by mainly China as a special economic zone and deep sea port, and as well stretching further from the west coast east towards Yunnan province, right across Myanmar. The Chinese are now basically moving on their proposals for a railway line that would link Yunnan with the coast, and they already have 2 functioning oil and gas pipelines that stretch from just off Chaopu through to Yunnan. And you can imagine the kind of stakes that are involved there for China, and how much more China is about to sink into not just Rakhine, but its so-called China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which was basically a plan inked and broadly agreed, or rather the framework was agreed late last year. Meanwhile, of course, we've seen this escalating insurgency in the state, as well as, the previous 2 years, the exodus, the brutal crackdown on Rohingya, and the rise of the Arakan army. So it's not looking too good for investment prospects, but, to look at how China operates in its Belt and Road initiatives and the way it's gone into other troubled regions, for example in Africa, there is an element there that suits China fine, that Western investors, not only deterred by international outrage and condemnation over human rights abuses in Rakhine State, and talk of indictments or prosecution of some members of the Myanmar military, but I think it also suits China that broadly Western investors are really not overly thrilled by the prospects of investing in a state that is seeing these kind of issues. And the Arakan army issue, I think, is the newest one, and it has introduced much more of a sort of security concern into that mix. Obviously, as I said, the key player in this respect is China, which has been deeply involved in Rakhine State since the early 90s, and initially through the negotiation of and completion of its Ramri Island facilities. So China actually developed a little island just off Chaopu many years ago for bringing in oil from the Middle East, and taking gas that was that's being extracted locally off the Rakhine coast, sticking it into pipelines, and these dual pipelines, as I said, go through to Yunnan. The lead agency in the new development in Chaopu is CITIC, which is a total Chinese government operation, and they are now completely focused on finalising, or at least negotiating, the details of this new big ambitious project for the economic corridor. Apart from that, I should also point out, way north in those areas that we've just been talking about, the Rakhine state government has also undertaken various things, including what looks to be it could be rather local, but it's a couple of economic zones, industrial zones up near the border. There's one, Kanyin Chang Economic Zone, which is near Mongdor, the northern main town of northern Rakhine, and the Ponna Kyun Industrial Zone, which is also up north. And also there's some livestock and agricultural zones being developed in northern Rakhine and also near the area of Malku. So you've got some economic activity. It's not a complete basket case, but how it's all going to be affected by the increased activity of the Arakan Army is a question that remains to be seen. So far, it's very clear, which fuels the kind of conspiracy theories of how much can China control or temper the activities of the Arakan Army. So far, no Chinese project, no Chinese pipeline has been touched by any of the ethnic armed groups, which says quite a lot, I think. The fact that if the Arakan Army or, in fact, further east, the so-called Northern Alliance, including the Kachin Independence Army, really wanted to make trouble and really wanted to flex muscles, you might see something like pipelines being bombed or other sort of, serious disruption to the economic activity. So I think I probably just leave it at that and let some discussion proceed on all this.
Thanks very much indeed. Look, there is a microphone over there, so anyone who wants to ask a question, if you're going to, can you make it a question, fairly short, and introduce yourself as well before you do so. And just before you do, there was one point I wanted to raise with both of you, which I think will be in a lot of people's minds, which is that the Army's strategy of targeting the Rohingyas, which looks like a planned operation by 2017, more or less to drive a lot of them out of the country, how does that tie in with the Army's view of the Arakan Army? I mean, is the Army trying to win Rakhine sympathy by being hard on the Rohingyas, or is its approach to the Rohingya entirely separated from its dealings with the Rakhine people and with the Arakan Army? I don't know whether any of you can comment on that.
I mean, what I would say is that the strategy that the Myanmar military used in response to the ARSA attacks, which drove out the hundreds of thousands of Rohingya, is actually the same strategy that it uses regularly in counterinsurgency operations all across Myanmar. The reason that the effect was so much worse, I think there's multiple reasons for that, but it was not an outlier in terms of tactics, it was an outlier in terms of consequences and results. In general, they have a counterinsurgency strategy, which has to be said, was started by the British and the French in Indochina, the British in Malaya, and the Americans in Vietnam, of seeing the civilian population as a support base for insurgency. And so you have to strategically hamlet them, or you have to prevent them from having contacts with the insurgents, and you see them as part of the milieu that you have to deal with. You see them as a military target. And that's the counterinsurgency strategy that the Tamil has pursued since the 1960s. And it pursued it against the Rohingya. The difference was it was a lowland area, very densely populated. There was extra animosity and nastiness and maybe planning, depending on how one analyzes things. And the consequences were horrific, as we saw. But if you talk to people in Kachin State, in Karen State, they very much recognize the hallmarks of what was done. Albeit on a different scale because of the different terrain and population density. So what they're doing with the Arakan Army, I think, is rather similar in the sense that they have declared security operations, an operations zone. There are reports of helicopter gunships attacking villages where Rakhine soldiers are known to be hiding out without any real distinction of the military and civilian elements. The difference is that this area here, where the Rohingya lived, there was 700,000 people in low-lying areas here, close to an international border. Where they're going now is up here in the mountains. There's a few thousand people, and so the implications are quite different, even if the approach is the same. I don't know if you.
I'd just add on that I think there was a fairly clear strategy of of the army to expel the Rohingya, as Richard says, in Mongdor. But I think one thing to worry about, if the operational tempo continues, we're going to see more internally displaced Rakhine and Moro and other minorities in these areas. And that's worrying because already the authorities have said that international relief agencies and most of the UN agencies are not allowed access to these areas. So that's going to fuel Rakhine resentment, I think, when you're going to have large numbers of internally displaced Rakhine unable to receive anything but government assistance. So I think that's a nightmare scenario, not across the border, but within the borders, which will only fuel resentment.
Right, we have a first question, please. Anyone like to take the microphone? Microphone's up there.
Good evening, everybody, and all of the speakers. Thank you so much discussing about our homeland, Arakan. We Rohingya support. It is the Arakan.
Sorry, can you just say who you are so people know what point of view you're speaking from? You describe who you are. Give us your name.
Yes. My name is Haji Ismail. I live here in Thailand, but I was born Butidong. My mother is from Mongdo and my father is from Butidong. My father is a government servicer, so at my young age, we move every town of the Arakan state. In Arakan state, there was 17 townships. We arrive every township and we know what township have how many Rakhine, how many Rohingya. Before now, last 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we Rohingya live all of the town, 17 towns. The Burmese army, government army, push us slowly from southern Arakan state to northern Arakan state. So international community and new journalists don't understand this point.
Sorry, can I just stop you a moment? Can you actually ask a question, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
We appreciate the Arakan army because they are fighting their rights. In Arakan state, there is no human rights. Genocide plan program is still running on Rohingya people. And Arakan army never killed Rohingya. We never had. This is a new plan program of Burmese army for not accept for do not accept the repatriation of the Rohingya from Bangladesh to Arakan state. It is very clear to understand that at the Kofi Annan recommendation, at the same day, only one day after the ARSA fight the police box. And this is also at this time in a big international pressure from come to Burmese army. At the same time, the Burmese army fighting.
Sorry, just stop for a moment. What's your question?
Yes,
just make a question.
Then my question is, it is very important, the fighting of the Arakan army and the Burmese army, why this time they are fighting each other. It is very clear to understand. We Rohingya believe for not accept the repatriation of the Rohingya people from Rakhine, for Bangladesh to Rakhine state. So international community, at this time, what you are thinking about this our Rohingya repatriation plan program? Thank you.
Well, I wasn't quite sure what the question was there. I think it was just looking at asking about whether Rohingyas factor into what's going on at the moment.
I think your question was, why now, and why the AA now? I think this has been coming for quite some time. I mean, they were formed 10 years ago, and I think they always had an aim to stage an armed resistance against the Myanmar state, against the Myanmar military. I think things dramatically changed in 2012 when there was communal violence and in some areas ethnic cleansing in Rakhine State. And things quite dramatically changed in October 2016 and then again in August 2017. But the Arakan Army was coming in not with any stated aim to target Muslims. They were coming in to target the security forces. So I think we shouldn't kind of overlap and kind of read too much into it, but we've got to try and understand how these dynamics are going to play out in the future. And to reiterate that the AA has been very disciplined most of the times in saying that their enemy is not the Rohingya. And in fact, Tun Marat Nang, the commander of the AA, has been quite prodigious in how many interviews he's done. It's fascinating to read through those interviews. And he said numerous times, don't be distracted by this. You've got to realise who the real enemy is, and that is the Myanmar state.
I think it's worth saying that Tun Marat Nang has a fairly international outlook. He's a former tour guide in Yangon with Daitham Travel. He speaks a bit of French and German as well as fluent English. And so I think he probably has a better grasp on how the world sees the situation than many in the Myanmar military, for example. And that's something that's worth keeping in mind. That doesn't mean that all of this is propaganda or pitch, but I do think he sees the bigger picture in a way that many in Myanmar don't.
Thanks very much. We have the next question, please. Please, the microphone's up there. Nigel.
Hello. Oh,
You all right?
Dave Kendall from the Bangkok
sorry.
Post.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Couldn't see you from
First of all, I'd like to thank the panelists. That was a lot of history and a lot of background in a very short space of time. We got a lot out of it. Gwen, can I ask you to clarify why is it that the Arakan Army and the other Burmese ethnic armies have not attacked Chinese economic interests? What is their strategic motive in doing that? And second, Facebook announced today that they were banning the Arakan Army and 3 other Facebook pages operated by ethnic armies. Will that have much of an impact, and how will the social media propaganda war play out over the next few years?
Thanks. I'll just take that first question if I may, and I have a view on the Facebook thing. But anyway, as I mentioned the fact that none of these Chinese projects or investments have been touched by not just Arakan Army, but any of the ethnic groups really, apart from the Myitsone Dam project, which is in another category, and we can talk about it briefly. But I think what's clear, what I was getting at, but it's very hard to say the extent to which China influences, or even, some would say, and I'd be interested what Dave and Richard, you think about this, but some do imply that China has an inordinate influence over the KIA, which of course was the protector and trainer of the AA, and the AA actually initially didn't fight in Rakhine at all. They were proteges of the KIA and trained with them and fought alongside them back when they were tiny, just a handful of fighters, and now presumably are still very connected to KIA. Some feel that, suggest that they still get weapons through the KIA, and that if they are part of a broader, drugs trade or other kind of economic activities, there's some confluence of interests there. So I think, what's clear though is that there is a deference to China, or at least a great mindfulness not to ruffle any Chinese feathers. And also, I gather, they're often seen with Chinese weapons, so I'm not suggesting for a moment that China arms them, but there are clearly sort of links, and the border cross-border relations are very strong. On Facebook, it's interesting, but as you know, Facebook's been under huge pressure lately, and their big move on Myanmar was to take down the pages of various generals who were fingered as being part of or responsible for part of the Rohingya crackdown. And I'd say that this is part of Facebook's whole kind of new effort to reassure people that they are really good after all, and they're going to act against any armed group that runs propaganda. And it'll be interesting to see if YouTube, did you get those videos off YouTube? We'll see if YouTube continues to run these, you know, glorification of Arakan Army operations. But you guys.
Just on the social media thing, one thing I would ask Facebook is if they're taking down the Arakan Army that we're talking about tonight's Facebook page and not the other one that's on the Thai-Burma border, because there's a lot of confusion about the two AAs. And in fact, the FCCT put a picture of the AA Korthule faction, which is just maybe 100 guys in the 6th Brigade of the Karen National Liberation Army across the Thai border. So, you know, Facebook's been notoriously inaccurate in a lot of things in Myanmar. So, yeah, let's see if they take down the right Facebook page. Secondly, most of the information I get from the AAs is on their website. So I don't think it's going to dramatically change their ability to project information and their official way of recounting events. Also, I think this is going to probably backfire to a certain extent amongst the Rakhine population, who will feel, you know, really quite resentful about this. But Facebook's going to have to be very vigilant in taking down everything that people repost and put up from normal Rakhine people. We all know that Facebook's enormously popular in Myanmar, but Facebook's going to have a small army themselves of monitors to actually take down everything that's said about the AA.
And some language capability in Rakhine.
Right, it was somebody else. Do you want to ask a question? Yeah, please, to go.
Good evening. This is Felix Haas. I'm independent consultant focused on economic affairs in Myanmar, at times political economy as well. I have two questions. The first one being, is there any territorial arrangement that you are seeing between Arakan Army and ARSA at that time? I heard that there have been meetings on the Bangladesh side on that. To what extent do you see cross-border operations of any of these groups beyond what you mentioned, any physical presence there? What is the policy of Bangladesh? And that as a first question. The second one, first a comment. I think Kayinchaun, this border trade zone, I mean, it's not working. Pongajun, it's an empty land, it's not working. So we see Chinese interest as dominant in Rakhine State, but also we see Indian interest that shouldn't be forgotten. We see the Kaladan multimodal transport transit system, which is basically connecting Sitwe, a port facility in Sitwe, with Palewa, and then with a 109-kilometer long road that would lead to Mizoram and that would help India connect to its borderlands, to Mizoram, in fact, in a transit trade arrangement. So, I mean, how are you seeing the geopolitical situation there? I mean, what challenges is India facing? But also, what are other international players, basically, demanding Rohingya repatriation? How are they seeing now the situation with Arakan Army? How can you insist in people returning to an area that is controlled by Arakan Army?
There's a lot of questions, I think, in one go there. All good points. I don't know who wants to take. There was a point about whether ARSA and AA have territorial splits, and then there's the Bangladesh factor, and then there's India and other superpowers.
So Kaladan has two prongs, as you know. One is the port in Sitwe linking to Calcutta for the beans and pulses trade, and the other one is this slightly adventurous Kaladan River project to link northeast India to that port. You know, if you were the operators of the Kaladan project, you wouldn't be too happy now because there's nothing going to be happening up here. That was always the less vital part of this. I think in Indian economic planners' minds, the sea route from Sitwe to Calcutta was always the key thing, and then they tacked on a bit of an adventurous kind of through the mountains link to northeast India because there's a policy of, you know, economically growing northeast India, and it's landlocked except for the chicken neck, and you need this. But it's been on go slow, and now it's going to be on freeze, I think. As you said, these so-called economic zones, they're not economic zones, they're little bits of land with a bit of hope attached and not much more going on. And the third question was, I've forgotten, so I'm going to hand it away.
The implications of the Arakan Army upsurge with Rohingya repatriation.
David, do you want to take that one? Or is that, I don't know whether it
Okay.
plays to you or anyone
Go
else,
on.
or Gwen. I don't
No,
mind. We're about to move on to big geostrategy, Gwen, which is your moment.
Okay. The first thing I would say on the Caladan project, it's an interesting observation. At the end of 2017, one of the most spectacular attacks up until that stage by the AA was actually on the Caladan River in Paletwa, which killed an estimated 12 Burmese army soldiers. It was a riverine resupply unit. That was ambushed, and that was probably one of the biggest engagements so far, which actually resulted in fighting in Buthidown and Choktor and Paletwa, in which helicopter gunships were called in. So certainly the AA have indicated that the Caladan is an area of operations, and they've proven that they can operate in that area. On the repatriations, I agree with everything that Richard and Gwen said. I think a lot of people have been trying to spin, in my view, in the past few weeks, that the AA uptick in operations is directly responsible for repatriation looking very unlikely. I think there were a dozen reasons why that was looking unlikely anyway. I think anything from just naked fear of nearly 1 million people who are not going to come back, and the arrangements not looking very palatable to a lot of people, and a host of other reasons. I don't think you can blame the AA's attacks on repatriation not happening. But it's certainly added to a whole host of very complicated factors.
Just one quick point. I remember what the third question was. It was links between ARSA and AA. Look, the only people who are putting information out that there have been meetings together with the geo-coordinates of the meetings are intelligence agencies, and one has to ask who those intelligence agencies are and what interest they have in putting this out. Before you ask then, is it true, right? It could be true, it could not be true. I just think it's unlikely that there's any strategic coordination between groups that would deeply undermine their respective support bases if it was ever to come out that they had been strategically coordinating. Is there a sort of understanding on both sides that it's not a good idea to shoot each other? Probably. If they come across each other in the jungle, do they just walk quietly by? Probably. Does that imply a deep strategic coordination? I really don't think so. But,
No, but I think possibly, and I've also read some of those, but there, one observation that was made was if there was any even peripheral kind of coordination, like we'll hit them there and you hit them there, that is one of the Tatmadaw, the military's deepest sort of paranoias, is if, although, you know, the big question is whether ARSA really exists now, and I think you two would probably have a better idea of how seriously they should now be taken. I mean, there's a view that they've been completely annihilated, but...
And I think, you know, the people who came out, or the person who came out with the claim of coordination between ARSA and the AA was Zorte, the presidential spokesperson. And he did that right after the 4th of January AA attack. So whatever the truth of the matter, and we have views on that, but whatever the truth of the matter, it didn't resonate with the Rakhine community. They all said, you know, on Facebook and elsewhere, this is just an attempt to denigrate us, and they don't believe it. So, you know, whatever the truth of it, it hasn't sort of set off, you know, a fury and astonishment among the Rakhine. It's just set them on the course that, well, this is, of course, this is what they would say.
And if I can just address your earlier point about those various border economic zones. Yes, as you say, they're kind of... Well, I think they're a little bit more than just a hope. I mean, particularly one that they're claiming will actually start running in March. I haven't been up there, so I don't know. But I really doubt that we're seeing a sort of glossy, nice economic zone with sort of full infrastructure. However, what has happened is that the Myanmar government has lent on local business very strongly. I mean, domestic Myanmar companies, including some very big ones, the biggest ones. So through their vehicle, they set up the Union Enterprise for Rakhine, blah-de-blah-de-blah, relief, whatever. So they actually managed to get more than $12 million out of Myanmar companies to seed this sort of basically state-backed conglomeration of companies. And
they didn't all pay, though.
They didn't all pay. They've still got some money. And the thing is, there will be some, I mean, definitely they're forcing and coercing and probably encouraging certain Myanmar companies to set up in these, in the border economic zones. So there'll be some attempt to, possibly, and basically if you provide enough incentive, including free land and complete tax breaks and all that, you will get some. So I think there will be some economic activities starting up there, and it's not like Rakhine State has absolutely no...
There's no labour.
It's
all gone.
Right, yeah, it's all gone. And also in their in their plans for redrawing northern Rakhine State and land usage, we all know that land is being offered to other people, not Rohingya who originally inhabited the land. So, I think that's where that's going, and also because companies are being coerced to cough up money and play along, there will be some element. Also, there seems now to be this enormous push on the Myanmar government side to be seen to be doing something more for Rakhine State in investment terms. So we've got this big investment forum happening in the beachside resort of Napoli in the south from the 21st this month, 2-day forum. All kinds of investor countries being invited, and quite a few of them, the Japanese there in full force. The Japanese are also starting to put money into Rakhine, mainly through JICA, but companies are being coerced to come. So there's clearly sort of efforts to either bash companies into playing along or other. And similarly, India, having funded this port in Sitwe, which is functioning, although, it's not a huge booming port, and Sitwe is an extremely shallow harbour, so you're not getting any, any capacity to bring in deep sea vessels, but that port is up and running. India also is pouring money into roads that go across Rakhine State. I don't know what state they're in at the moment. The last photo I saw showed not much progress, but the rhetoric's there, and India is obviously clearly interested. It's basically India and China who are the two big players, or could become extremely big players in Rakhine State, and it suits them fine if Western investors are deterred, so I don't think they're particularly keen to get Westerners involved.
I noticed that no one's mentioned the role of Bangladesh, particularly in relation to the Arakan army. I mean, does it have a... Sorry, I was just picking up on this
Go ahead.
Point. Yeah. Sorry?
Yeah. Go on.
Do you want to start?
What do you want to say about it?
Please do.
I'm Matt Desmond. I'm another of these independent consultants based in Yangon, particular interest in Bangladesh. Because I'm an independent consultant, my sources are very limited and often wrong, so I appreciate the panel's advice on this.
The panel's full of independent consultants.
That's how we survive. We hang in together. Crush, clearance, total clearance, crush the Arakan army. Do we have evidence that this is actually happening? Or are we assuming that orders are not being fully complied with by the military? And the related question is, does the panel have any comment on the possibility of militarization of the border from the Bangladesh side? Just leave those open.
Okay.
Okay, so two questions, I think. First, the strategy of the AA and is fighting going on? Well, the AA claims that there has been a number of clashes in the past couple of weeks. They reported one just the other day. And so has the Myanmar military. They said that there has been ongoing clashes. Now, I think it's important to realise that if the AA have played it this smart for this long, they're not going to sit around in large numbers and be targeted by the way that the Myanmar military fights wars, which is increasing use of heavy firepower. And we saw this last week when there was an engagement, and then they sent artillery fire into a village, killing a 7-year-old boy.